Previously on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. It's late August 1923, and after a 4-month government inquiry, the Sykes Report publishes on the BBC's future. And the result? The BBC has a future. And it won't be operated by a government wing. Instead, it'll be operated by the company management as is. That's John Reith in charge, reporting to a board of directors who came from wireless firms. And there are to be no ads on this BBC. They've got a new improved licence fee deal, and they've bought themselves another couple of years of operation. But ever since that Sykes committee met, from April to August 1923, something else has been going on in the background. While the inquiry inquired, the engineers engineered. This time on the podcast, SB, that's Simultaneous Broadcasting. Tested since April 1923, launched officially August 1923, helping to shape early localised BBC into a national broadcast service. It would use landlines to send one station to others. So simultaneous broadcasting paved the way for modern-day networking that we see today, but along the way, relay stations, the national programme, and essentially giving more people access to radio. Plus we have a guest to this episode, of course, and that is BBC alumna, as in she used to work there, Mary English. She has memories of Langham Place, Bush House, and more since she began working at the BBC in the 1970s. But we go back 50 years before that to the 1920s for simultaneous broadcasting. This is episode 102 of the British Broadcasting Century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, welcome to the British Broadcasting Century. I'm Paul Carenza, you are you, and you're marvellous for joining us on this moment-by-moment origin story of the world of broadcasting, especially British broadcasting, especially the early BBC. Now, as ever, I should point out, today's BBC are nothing to do with this podcast. It's solely and independently run by this fella. I work now and then for the BBC, oddly in these two different areas. I've got a sitcom on the air at the minute, Not Going Out, that I've been co-writing with Lee Mack and Danny Peake and others for over 100 episodes now, so that's quite nice. And I also do religious broadcasting, the Daily Service, Pause for Thought, and things like that on BBC Radio. But I'm fascinated with how it all began. And part of that is this podcast. Part of it also is in-person things. So I was delighted recently to go to the Early Recordings Conference, and you can see my excerpt from that on YouTube. I'll put the link in the show notes. I was talking about the earliest recording of the BBC, which was the first Monarch on the air. We did that as an episode of the podcast a while ago, but I found some new information about what happened to that first recording, or didn't happen. In other words, preservation. So Early Recordings Conference, link in the show notes if you'd like to see me waffle away for half an hour in the presentation there. And it was a delight to join the wonderful academics and experts and musicologists who are part of the Early Recordings Association. Other in-person things coming up. You must come to Camden Fringe in August 5th and 6th. An evening of very old radio is my one-man show about the early BBC, and the Water Rats pub is where I'll be for Camden Fringe this year. And I'll be taking the show to West Berkshire Comedy Festival, that's Newbury, 24th of July. I'll be going to the Isle of Wight 1st of August. If you're at Greenbelt Festival in Kettering, August Bank Holiday, I'll be doing God on Air, a century plus of broadcast blessings. And then this autumn, more places, including Ealing and Petersfield Museum. Do look at paulcarenza.com/tour for details of those. And again, the link's in the show notes. But enough of these things, much as I want to lure you along to them. Oh, and my walking tour, BBC sites. Did I mention that? Again, link in show notes. Let's go back to 1923. Lots to talk about simultaneous broadcasting. It's engineering. It's a bit nerdy. We'll do our best to make it as accessible as possible, because this is a key moment in the early BBC story. A major leap for them, sending one station to many, or indeed all stations across the country. So it's a 4-month build-up of engineering tests and ultimately the launch of simultaneous broadcasting. And what was the BBC's first official simultaneous broadcast? I'll tell you at the end of this episode. It involves one of our favourite regular characters doing something new. So multiple choice. Will the BBC's first simultaneous broadcast be Arthur Burrows singing a song about bees? Or will it be John Reith reading the news? Or will it be Peter Eckersley giving us a sports commentary on llama racing? The answer will be revealed later in episode 102, the British Simultaneous Broadcasting Century. When the BBC began, it was a local service. Of course, it was London, Manchester, Birmingham to begin with, broadcasting completely different content, chosen by the station directors and by those who worked there. Same was true when the fourth station launched, Newcastle 5&0, just before Christmas 1922. Their studio couldn't fit a brass band, for example. They were fond of Hawaiian guitar music. There was a nice local band who provided that, and the high plinky notes of Hawaiian guitar cut through the ether more clearly than piano and cello. So that's what Newcastle did. They had a farmer's corner as well. I think the origin of Farming Today, still on Radio 4 now. And in February-March 1923, you get Cardiff and Glasgow adding Welsh and Scottish programming, local performers who knew what their listeners might like. So they all did their own different things. BBC High Command was well aware local independence meant that innovations could actually flourish, including, for example, the Birmingham station had half a dozen studio lights to tell the soloist to go louder or quieter or near the microphone or further away, other fine-tuning such as that. So there was a benefit to letting each station do their own thing. But London was where head office was, and a leader like Reith thought that London knows best. And indeed, it had access to West End stars and speakers or lecturers from the capital's institutions. And while it was all very well that artistes would tour around so the same musical content could be spread around the different places, they were all still doing their own thing autonomously. And that would continue, it's worth saying, under simultaneous broadcasting. There wouldn't be a London takeover of the entire schedules, but it would be a start. There'd be regular moments in the week. Maybe 2 programmes a week was the idea, where simultaneous broadcasting, largely from London, would be on all frequencies. Other stations too, though. Glasgow concert might be heard everywhere, or Birmingham or Cardiff might take control and give us what they've got.
There was the first simultaneous broadcast, that is to say, the first time that the news had been read in a London studio and transmitted from the 7 or 8 transmitters which were in operation in various parts of the country at that time.
That's Harold Bishop there, not the Neighbours character, but early engineer of note at the BBC, recalling how simultaneous broadcasting was this landmark moment. But first they had to get it working. Peter Eckersley took this on as his main day-to-day challenge. He noted later that year in one of the first Radio Times columns that simultaneous broadcasting was nothing new. I well remember when Captain Round and Mr. Ditcham of the Marconi Company were doing the original experiments on broadcast telephony down in Chelmsford, trying the idea out. We put in from Marconi House, London, an ordinary trunk call to Chelmsford. We connected on to wireless at Chelmsford. We listened by wireless in London, and thus I sat down in a little room and I talked to Captain Round vid this chain. It may seem to many a complicated method of communication, inasmuch as he was about 2 yards from me, but scientific people are always doing silly things like that to illustrate a principle. So spring 1923, BBC Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley and team got underway. 20th of March was the first simultaneous broadcasting test, I believe. Birmingham music reaching London, very much beyond expectation, reflected Wireless World. So yes, they had to test these things, and they didn't quite know what the quality would be like broadcasting via landline to different radio stations. And they had to test this publicly after hours. Wireless World magazine. Those who listened in after the usual broadcast programme on Monday, April 16th, were able to hear speech and music with surprising clarity from the Glasgow station. 2LO London announced a period of testing, and it was only at the conclusion of several musical items that listeners were informed they had been hearing 5SC from Glasgow. Other press noted that there was in fact demand for such a thing. The Pall Mall Gazette a week later showed listeners wanted, occasionally, to hear what was happening elsewhere. All-Star programme not for provinces. In view of the All-Star programme which the London station of the British Broadcast Company is to put on Thursday, in celebration of the royal wedding, the suggestion has been made in many quarters the concert should be sent over landlines to the stations in the provinces and Scotland, so that listeners in all over the country might have an opportunity of enjoying it. When asked this morning if this could be done, the BBC stated that much as they would like to be able to follow out the suggestion, the time at their disposal was much too short to allow the arrangement to be made. Yeah, the tech wasn't ready. Only London heard that all-star concert. That's George Roby and the Co-Optimists, the Harrods concert we've mentioned several episodes ago. So one reason for simultaneous broadcasting is listeners could hear big concerts like that. Another reason would be to save acts touring around, as they did with the laundry basket of records and sheet music for local stations to have this touring programme of artists and content. And it wouldn't be long, end of the year, 24th November 23, that London's Old Vic Theatre sent out La Traviata's first act to all stations. So this would be the beginning of regular, widespread entertainment and culture from one city to the entire nation. But there was another reason to have simultaneous broadcasting, rather than just replacing a station's existing programmes with whatever London was doing. The dream of Captain Peter Eckersley, the chief engineer, was that, at minimum, everyone should be able to hear one programme clearly on a cheap set. Everyone in the country.
The policy of the chief engineer of the BBC. Well, you know, it isn't so obvious. I must say that some people had the idea that we ought to make it rather difficult for the people to pick up these signals. Otherwise, the manufacturers would not sell expensive apparatus. Some people were as silly as that. I must say they soon gave way.
So if you didn't live near one of those half dozen or so cities that had a radio station, 25 miles was pretty much the radius of a decent signal for basic crystal sets. So for the majority of the population, they needed something different. So there was this relay station plan afoot.
We erected a little 250-watt station in the middle of the town, and that was sufficient to bring in 100, 200,000, 300,000 new listeners, and therefore £150,000 more revenue, except for the Postmaster General pinch. So there we began, and we dotted these stations all about.
Lower power, filling the gaps in the land, places like Sheffield, Edinburgh, Plymouth. There was poor reception, and you couldn't hear much on a low power set. So they put new stations there, little ones, but they couldn't really afford yet more original local programming. Instead, then, they chose to start on these smaller relay stations, something more simultaneously broadcast. Meanwhile, the tests continued. 14th of May 1923, the Dundee Courier. An interesting and successful experiment was carried out yesterday afternoon when London broadcasting station 2LO made use of the ordinary telephone landlines relaying a programme given at Marconi House to the 5 provincial broadcasting stations, Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, Cardiff and Glasgow, who transmitted it through the ether simultaneously. The programme was not a concert in the exact meaning of the word, but it was most decidedly rare entertainment. Hello, 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 this is the London station of the British Broadcasting Company speaking. Hello, 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 this is 2LO. Only with difficulty could I make out what the speaker was saying. There were a few snatches of a popular song, a recitation of the alphabet backwards. The speaker at the microphone inquired of his colleagues in the studio, who apparently were listening in, if the signals were clear. Rotten, was the reply, evidently not intended to reach the microphone. Yeah, so this entertainment was just a test, really, but people were, of course, listening in. In a lot of these tests, there were crosstalk problems. You could hear others. Captain Peter Eckersley, an irascible gentleman, I believe, tried to communicate between London and Manchester one night, but all he could hear was the last act of a Wagner opera rattling his earpiece. Another potential listener gone. Yes, they would have to learn to coexist, perhaps on lower power. Word was getting around about what the BBC were doing, and there was the question, would this harm local programming? Wireless World magazine sought to reassure. A BBC representative said, "Some people have an erroneous idea. The object of the tests is to have one central station from which a programme may be carried out, the remaining broadcasting stations radiating that same programme. This scheme would, of course, destroy local colour, as a singer in London would hardly be as much appreciated in Lancashire as a Lancashire singer would be. Items, however, such as the opera from Covent Garden Theatre, and notable singers who sing from time to time from one of the broadcasting stations, would be highly appreciated, no matter where they might be." So he's reassuring people local programming will continue, but now and again, as indeed in an experiment, 30th of May 1923, Covent Garden Opera was heard for the first time throughout the land. It was the last act of Hansel and Gretel, and this is OB and SB at the same time. What's that then? Outside broadcast and simultaneous broadcasting working together. They wired up the Opera House in Covent Garden, and you could hear it throughout Britain. Goes to show how ambitious they were getting. Just 1 year earlier, Arthur Burrows had launched 2LO pre-BBC with a boxing match that was knockout in under a minute, without any live music to fall back on. And now they were scattering Covent Garden Opera across the land. Peter Eckersley. Our enthusiasm was maintained by a competition with ourselves. We were on trial against the measure of our ambitions, and so we never became complacent. We'll leave Peter Eckersley and team to finesse SB, and we look forward to launching it before the end of this episode and hear whether it was Eckersley with a sports commentary, Reith with the news, or Arthur Burrows with a song that first launched SBs. But now time for a guest, I think, with tales of when she worked at the BBC from the 1970s onwards. This is Mary English.
Well, I grew up in a radio household, because my mother always had the radio on, and she, so all through the war years, it kept the spirits up. So she kept, we always had the radio on. So it was a soundtrack to my childhood, really. And I loved actors and writing and wanted to work out a way of putting them all together. And it occurred to me one day, I had a eureka moment, and I thought, well, the BBC, the obvious place to go. Mm-hmm. And I joined as a secretary to get in and find out what jobs there were. And I wanted to work in the studios with the actors. And I came across a job called a studio manager, which did just that. And I thought, well, that's absolutely perfect. I started that training in 1973. There were 9 of us, I think, on the course. And in those days, we still had some of the war equipment, because before the war, all the studio managers were men. Right. So the equipment was designed for men, all the old stuff. So we were trained on this very old, heavy equipment, with huge rotary faders to fade the mics in and out, big black Bakelite things. And we had 78 machines and tape machines the size of Argos. So we had to train on those, and we had to train on the new equipment because they were bringing stereo in and CDs. So, and that was all done in the Langham.
Was this a particular time of change, do you think, or is it always?
I think it's always changing, but the 70s, I think there was quite a lot of change because, stereo came in, CDs came in, phone-in programs, consumer programs. There was a lot going on. And famously, the first programs from Parliament were done in 1975. We were asked if we wanted to take part. We were a bit sceptical. We couldn't think why people would be interested. And we had 2 mobile studios parked on College Green. We had to get the MPs in and interview them. And of course, the interesting thing was that they were very rowdy. Nobody had ever heard them before.
Right,
and I wrote in my diary that night, what a noisy bunch, because we all just thought they sat there politely. And the public were amazed, writing letters, furious of Tunbridge Wells, all this shouting and jeering. First time we'd heard them. Those were done in 1975, yeah.
It's odd to think, obviously, on this podcast, we've been particularly dwelling in the very early years of the 1920s and the like. And the first voice of the BBC, Arthur Burrows, in 4 years before the BBC, 1918, wrote this memo saying we could use this technology to transmit from, say, Parliament and transmit these parliamentary speeches. But it took another half century, really, before we actually got close to that. But that was the original idea, seemingly, behind broadcasting. Yes. But once you hear these MPs, yeah, you're quite right. We've only seen it in print before. They seem quite elevated and distant. Once you actually hear from them, rather different story.
Yes, it was a shock. I mean, I was surprised, I must admit. We didn't think it would catch on, but of course, as we know, it did. No, it was a time of change. And of course, I also worked at Bush House because as part of the training, you worked at Bush House, and that was an amazing place. We had 38 language sections and the World Service.
Yes.
And it was broadcasting day and night under the Aldwych, people completely unaware probably. I remember Georgy Markov, who was killed with a poison umbrella on Waterloo Bridge. He was a Bulgarian dissident, very quiet man, but rebellious, and worked with him. And all these wonderful language sections. And at any time of the day or night, you could go into the canteen and have a meal with all sorts of people. And George Orwell worked there. And under the name of Eric Blair, he described it in 1984, the Ministry of Truth, as this underground canteen. And that was based on the Bush House canteen. And he described the BBC as a mixture of a girls' boarding school and a lunatic asylum.
And would you back up that definition?
Well, there were days when, things went wrong. I mean, you don't hear about it so much in radio. We get television shows behind the scenes, but lots of things go wrong in radio, and you never hear about them, which is a shame.
Is it because they can be covered up and before you know it, we can't see the look on someone's face when the panic sets in, and before you know it, we
Probably.
just. Also, I wonder sometimes if I think it's my radio set going wrong, and I think, my thing's cut out there, not realizing actually it's for everybody.
Yes. Well, there was a famous one day. I used to do a show with Pete Murray quite a lot. The wonderful Pete Murray, who's still going, nearly about to be 100. He had a show called Open House on Radio 2, which was on from 9 o'clock to 11:30, which was peak time in those days. We used to get 13 million listeners. It's just unheard of.
Wow.
And one day we had Irene Handel, wonderful old actress who used to play, old ladies who weren't as innocent as they seemed, sort of thing. And she came in. It was a cold day. She had a big fur coat on, and she went in, and this was live. I was on the panel. We opened up the mics. Pete started to talk to her, and we could hear a strange noise. And the producer said to me, "I think you better go in. This is annoying." So I went in, and it was coming from her. And I said, "I'm very sorry about this. It was a funny noise." And she said, "Oh, it's probably this, dear." I opened her fur coat, and there was a little chihuahua inside, fast asleep, snoring its head off. So we had to explain to the listeners, and that was fine, but it was rather sweet. I mean, it was awe-inspiring, really, because you went in every day and you never knew who you would meet. Rex Harrison, Ingrid Bergman, Claire Bloom, Michael Caine, people like ABBA came in to Open House not long after they'd won, which was exciting, and all the publicity going around it. And of course, Desert Island Discs was a lovely program to do. I did that a lot. And I used to go in great excitement, thinking, I wonder who it'll be today, That's such a simple program. So simple, but still listen.
So Roy Plomley to begin with, and then Sue Lawley in the 80s, wasn't it, I guess?
Yeah, so Michael Parkinson too took over from Roy Plumley. He did a stint, and then Sue Lawley. And I did a bit of those. I did a couple under Roy Plumley, and then it transitioned. But it was always interesting. But what we used to do was pre-record it, because a lot of actors are very nervous, and they and ah. So we had 10-inch metal reels, and we'd have to cut out the ums and ers. So we used to call it de-umming. So you'd be in the corner with your headphones on, cutting out all the ums and ers, many as we thought was reasonable. And I once reduced a program by 6 minutes because it was a very nervous actor. And the producer said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to need more music." So we had to remix the whole of Desert Island Disc and put more music in to make up for the lack of speech.
Having edited 90 plus of podcasts of this, and some of our guests and more than others. So not you, of course. No ums and so far. But there's some episodes where I'm looking, and I can spot digitally now what an looks like and and I think that's one there. And sure enough, you highlighting it, and it was. And I wonder about sometimes just putting them all together in one little collection, all of the ums and ers. So maybe that episode when they had that actor with 6 minutes of ums and ers, they could have just filled the time with just the ums and ers the collected works.
Yes.
The collected hesitations of this actor.
It was a nice thing to do, editing, and you could edit music as well. You could cut out verses of music and stick them together again. It was very satisfying.
But of course, you're doing it on...
Of course, it doesn't happen now.
No, and you're doing it on properly, on tape. None of this digital nonsense. The physical act of editing is very, very different now, isn't it?
No. And there was another occasion when, because it was always a great coup if you got a prime minister in, and we had Mrs. Thatcher in. It was during the Falklands. She was due to do The World at One and be interviewed live. And people used to record things on Ewers in those days, portable tape recorders. The reporters would take out and interview people. And a reporter came in just before the programme went on air, and he said, "Quick, we've got to get this edited before Mrs. Thatcher comes in. We want to play it to her." So we were editing it, great speed. And I made the cardinal mistake of putting my hand on the machine. It was a 10-inch metal reel to try and stop it because I was rushing. And of course, cut my finger just as she was arriving. And the producer said, we can't stop. So there was blood everywhere. I mean, I don't think she saw it because it was up the wall, it was on the producer, it was on me, like a bloodbath. And I often think, if she'd looked through, blissfully unaware, I mean, the interview was going on, and there was all this chaos behind the glass. And of course, we always used to carry a bag of razor blades around and things. And I remember, because the IRA were very active in the 70s, and I remember I had this bag of razor blades and I was going somewhere and I was searched and they came out with this tin and said, "What's this?" And I work for the BBC, as if that explained it. It looked highly suspect. Good days.
Good day. So you started in 73. So when did you leave the BBC? When did you leave broadcasting? And was it, how different was it when you left compared with how you started?
It was changing because, well, a lot of my friends had left, for different reasons. Some had gone to television, some had just left. And I remember thinking, well, I don't want to be here to the day I retire. I don't think that's very good. And I started in 1982. I did an attachment to television as a trainee. But while I was there, I started writing sketches for the television. There were lots of sketch shows in those days, and I started writing for a show called Three of a Kind with Lenny Henry. And then I wrote for other things like Hale and Pace, and Brian Conley was just starting. A lot of those people were just starting, and there was a lot of work around. I think I got something on the Two Ronnies. So I was doing that as a hobby. I wanted to do it full time. So I decided to leave in 1986. But what I did, I moved up to Yorkshire, and I got a job in a radio station because commercial radio was starting to spread for a company called Pennine Radio, which was based in Bradford. It's quite a change from the BBC. And I wrote and produced all the commercials, which was a very similar job because the sales team would come in and say, we want 10 commercials by 6 o'clock for this car company or whatever it was. And I had to write them, and then I'd get actors in, and then I'd edit them. So I was effectively doing my own job.
All of those adaptable skills, moving around, telling stories, connecting with people, working in technology.
No, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful world to be in. But I remember walking in the first day through those doors. I mean, that wonderful building, the ship going down Regent Street, that extraordinary building, and going through those doors that, you see so many, and thinking, all the people that have been here through the years. Another thing that happened was I did a recording with Princess Michael for Woman's Hour, which was a bit nerve-wracking because all the suits were in and I was in charge of it. I was praying nothing would go wrong. It didn't, thank God. At the end, somebody said, get the book. And the book was the BBC autograph book, which I think had been started, from the beginning of time. And we weren't allowed really to touch it, but they did flick through and show us. And just flicking through, you could see Churchill, Chamberlain, the Queen and Prince Philip, Dylan Thomas, and you thought, my goodness, all these people that have signed this book.
I didn't know there was one.
The broadcast from this. No, well, I expect it's locked in the DG's office. I don't know, but I would have loved to have had time with it, but it was snatched away again.
I saw. Obviously, I'm a geek for the early BBC, the 1920s and 30s and things. And I saw on eBay a while ago there was an autograph book of the people who worked at the BBC to begin with, literally the first 50, 100, maybe 200 people. And I think it went out of my pay grade very quickly. But you could see the pictures, see the snapshots of it, and just see, wow, these people were all there when this started with just 4 people, and then 10 people, and then 50 people. How it's grown from there, let alone how those dignitaries that have now since, as you say in that autograph book. I didn't know there was one. That's great to know.
No, well, it's the only time I ever saw it, because it came out that day.
Thank you, Mary. That's Mary English, ex of the BBC. More from her and her memories of working at Auntie Beeb before this episode is out. But for now, back in August of 1923, we have SB to launch, Simultaneous Broadcasting. Arthur Burrows, first voice of the BBC and its first director of programmes, wrote romantically of SB in his book The Story of Broadcasting. The microphone in the studio is connected through the amplifier not merely with the London station, but with every other broadcasting station in the British Isles. It is linked physically by thousands of miles of copper telephone wire passing over mountains, down valleys, along coasts, and across moorlands to counties as remote as Aberdeenshire and Devonshire, which isn't the real name of a county. Chief Engineer Peter Eckersley wrote of simultaneous broadcasting less movingly. It was a time for him of great conflict and consternation behind the scenes. He was battling with the General Post Office about how to get the best or the least worst result from their rather wonky landlines. Reith asked them to define what suitable land wire was, because whatever the BBC were renting from them didn't quite seem suitable land wire for them. Reith's same message to the post office gently suggested that a line should transmit frequencies of up to 6,000 hertz to transmit music, to which the post office replied to Reith essentially saying, yes, we know, we're trying. You can feel the passive-aggressive tone radiating across the century between Post Office and BBC, and bear in mind at this point there was still the Sykes Committee underway, trying to inquire as to how best move forward the BBC, Post Office and government relationship. So Eckersley, chief engineer, was also chief negotiator in this case, and he managed to get a special rate out of the post office, lines to each station, one line each, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for £191 per month, and that included business conversations as well as simultaneous broadcasting. But there's only one line between each of the BBC stations. So much as they could have business conversations, they would have to share that line with what was being used for broadcasting. In other words, engineers would speak down that line to each other first, they would make all the plans they needed to, and then they'd switch to the programme while it was then being simultaneously broadcast throughout the nation and transmit it. Then maybe a curt hello between engineers after the programme to grumble about what went wrong. But still in the test phase, the Western Mail reported on the 5th of July 1923, "The scheme of simultaneous broadcasting from all stations of the British Broadcasting Company, which was attempted a few weeks ago, is now in abeyance. Although the preliminary tests were very successful from a wireless point of view, it's understood that considerable interference was experienced on one or two occasions from ordinary landline telephone conversations. It's stated that the interference was mutual. On the one hand, the broadcast speech interfered with the telephone conversation. On the other hand, the telephone conversation was transferred to the broadcast line and subsequently radiated with other broadcast matter." Yeah, that's not ideal. You're having a chat with your mum and suddenly it's being broadcast on the BBC by accident. Engineers did find often if there was a fault on the line, you wait for the interval in the programme and then you'd phone on the same line and that might clear the interference. But, it's early days. So at the main stations, there was a lot more switching involved. A lot more engineers had to be hired, and the BBC workforce grew, especially in the engineering department. Meanwhile, rumbles continued about whether or not this was actually doing down local broadcasting. Deputy Director of Programmes Cecil Lewis admitted as such, but painted it as a good thing, telling station directors on the 22nd of August 23, "The saving of expenditure by closing provincial stations for a few hours twice a week would be such as to enable artistes of worldwide reputation to broadcast from London." So in other words, we'd save money locally and put that toward broadcasting West End superstars. But the first to simultaneously broadcast in an official capacity, once this test phase was done, was not an artiste of worldwide reputation, but a BBC chappie of reputation on this podcast. Yes, it's launch time of SB. And earlier this episode, I asked you who gave the first official simultaneous broadcast throughout the land. Was it A, Arthur Burrows singing a song about bees? Was it B, John Reith reading the news? Or was it C, Peter Eckersley, the chief engineer, doing a sports commentary on llama racing? The answer is the most boring of the answers. John Reith was reading the news. He took to the airwaves, choosing himself to launch simultaneous broadcasting. Yes, it's like Tim Davie nudging Fiona Bruce out the way so he can read the headlines across the land for the first time. 29th of August, 1923. John Reith noted, "Read the news bulletin at 7 o'clock, the first real SB. The switchboard is quite thrilling. Everything went successfully." Reith's headlines included a diplomatic row between Greece and Italy, and had he a crystal ball, Reith could have given the news that that very day 2 babies were born who would grow up to make their mark on British media. Director and actor Richard Attenborough, born that very day, 29th of August 1923. Of course, Attenborough would go on to make films, open Jurassic Park, and have a brother who would run BBC Two while making wildlife documentaries. And also, his time twin, born that day, was Marmaduke Hussey, future BBC chairman through the 80s and 90s. But of course, John Reith did not announce those births. That would be silly. In fact, did Reith announce anything? I think he did, personally. His diary said so. But BBC engineer Harold Bishop later recalled that Cecil Lewis gave the first news bulletin.
We used, of course, post office lines connected up to London. And I remember, Cecil Lewis getting very confused and using some rather peculiar language at the end of the bulletin, not knowing what to do next.
Harold Bishop there in 1959. In 1935 he wrote of this as well, saying Cecil Lewis was so overcome by the importance of the occasion, he ended the news bulletin by saying, "What the devil do I do next?" I don't know if he meant which button he should push or what he should do next career-wise. Personally, I've felt both thoughts in my time working at BBC Radio. That quote there was from World Radio magazine, by the way, which in fact turns 100 this very month as this podcast lands. Thank you, Mark Allison, for tipping me off about World Radio's centenary. 19th July 1925, that's when the Foreign and Technical Journal of the BBC was first launched. And Harold Bishop there in World Radio, recalling that Cecil Lewis was the first or one of the first simultaneous broadcasters, perhaps. I do believe that John Reith was the first. Elsewhere in print, this from the Gloucester Citizen, 31st of August 1923. I gather that Wednesday's experiment of transmitting time signals and news bulletins from the London station by landlines to all the provincial stations was a great success. The promoters will now, one presumes, carry on with the expansion of this scheme, and so enable listeners in all over the provinces to enjoy at least once a week a high-class concert, such as London broadcasters have been accustomed to hear. Lovely to hear the word broadcatchers there, isn't it? In this newspaper article, provided for us, as ever, by our newspaper detective, Andrew Barker. Andrew, we doff our caps to you. I hear on good authority that the first of these concerts to be relayed from London to the provincial stations, and there broadcasted on Monday night, is to be conducted by Sir Edward Elgar, the eminent composer, who is reputed to have taught himself everything in the art of music. In other spheres, one hears of occasional criticism of a somewhat severe kind that London should monopolise affairs to such a large extent. The present scheme, however, should give rise to no such criticism from the provincial broadcatcher, since he is assured of being able to receive the best programmes, not only of the London station, but later on of other provincial stations. London broadcasters, at any rate, are highly delighted at the prospect of being able to receive the Rob Roy programme of the Edinburgh station. Ah yes, Rob Roy to follow. We'll look at that and other moments of late August and September 23 on the next episode of this podcast. But as for this episode, let's return to our guest. Formerly of Auntie Beeb's employ, half a century after simultaneous broadcasting came in, here's Mary English.
In those days, we had Egerton House, which was where the Radio 1 came from. Steve Wright and Emperor Roscoe and all those people used to broadcast from there.
So
and the gramophone library was there.
Oh, yeah.
That's now all, I don't know, it's all incorporated.
I think it must have had its own character, though, back when it was its own separate building. And Egerton.
Oh, yes. It was a funny little place, really. I mean, the studios were very strange. And, the sight lines weren't very good. And the equipment was quite old, but, it had a character to it. The same with the Langham. Well, the Langham was our club. It was a nice place to go and have lunch. When you were working with actors, we'd all go together. And our training studios were there. And there were also beds upstairs if you wanted, because people were doing shift work, announcers and newsreaders. And I tried it one night when I was working the shift, and it was a nightmare because the door was banging all night. People coming off shifts, people starting. And they did say it was haunted. I don't know if it was, but I didn't do that again. I moved to London anyway by then. So I gave it a try. But,
the Langham,
it was a wonderful building.
Yeah, the Langham then, just for listeners' benefit, so the building just opposite Broadcasting House, you've got All Souls Church, Broadcasting House and the Langham, which is now a hotel, private hotel, but back for, I think, a couple of decades, maybe longer, was BBC, entirely owned by the BBC, and radio training, I think, particularly was based there.
Yes, we did all our training there. Dummy studios. There's a wonderful intimacy about radio, isn't it? Because you take it everywhere with you. It's in the car, it's in the house, you can walk with it. It's that one-to-one, somebody telling you a story, somebody talking to you. Wonderful medium. And you can do a lot with it. Yeah. And plays were interesting to do when stereo came in, doing the Battle of Britain for schools and in stereo, literally feeling the aeroplanes going over, things like that. And some of the studios in the old building were in the basement, and we had trouble with the underground because it ran just underneath. So every now and then, particularly if it was rush hour, you get this rumbling. And you can't edit if you've got a background sound, so we had to keep stopping. So that was frustrating. I'm sure they've rectified all that now.
I did hear the other day someone said that at Broadcasting House you still get the rumble of is it the Central Line or the Bakerloo? I think largely because Broadcasting House seems to be, the studios have this brick wall, it's a building within a building, so you've got this brick wall all around it, which was great in the Second World War. So when the Blitz happened, and that's why that newsreader could carry on reporting, knowing he was in the inner bit. The studios were safe.
Yes.
But it does send the sound of the underground straight up through that, I think, now into the new studios some days.
Oh, does it? Still there?
I think it's still there. Yeah.
No, we had a lot of trouble with that. And then when they were redoing studios, that was a nightmare because there'd be a lot of hammering because we're getting rid of the old ones gradually. And it used to happen in Woman's Hour a lot. Sue McGregor used to go mad. I mean, she was a wonderful broadcaster. And we had to get a knocking chit. So we had to go and find them and give them a piece of paper and say, can you stop? We're on air. And of course, they were constantly having to stop.
I should clarify, in case the audio was difficult, a knocking chit.
Yes.
A knocking chit. Okay, just nice and clear. A piece of paper. Marvellous.
Piece of paper. Here we go again. Can you stop for an hour? Anyway, I don't suppose that happens now. I mean, another thing that we used to do in those days was the wonderful Alistair Cook letter from America. Whenever there was a good broadcaster, they used to fly one in, a copy, but they also had a standby copy in the studio. And one evening I was recording it and there was a hold up on the tube. And I thought, I'm going to be late. I'm going to be late. I can't be late for Alice to cook. Tore up Regent Street, threw the machine on. I got it just as the line was coming up, but I missed the G off the good. So this is where the editing came in. When it finished, I dubbed another G from somewhere and cut it on. But again, nobody would know. But it was a hairy moment. I thought, oh, can't miss Alistair Cook. And of course, in the war days, we had Ed Murrow, who was broadcasting from the roof during the Blitz. That was another amazing man.
Roof of the Langham, wasn't it? I think he did that, and a few other places, or
Yes,
different
possibly.
buildings.
He was American.
Different buildings, yeah.
That was how the BBC got its reputation, because we broadcast our defeats. We broadcast the fall of Singapore, so people thought, well, they're speaking the truth. They're broadcasting their defeats, and that's how it got its reputation.
That's an interesting way of looking at it.
Don't know if it has. Yeah, I don't know if it has now, but it did then.
Yeah, it's funny, yeah, because some of the things you sometimes see the BBC on social media getting a bit of obviously a bit of a bad rap, but whenever they investigate their own failings, their own fallacies, you have that odd thing of a BBC reporter saying the BBC hasn't replied to my request for comment, and you think, well, you are the BBC, or you're not. You're representing the BBC, but you're by the BBC.
Yes.
But they do.
Yes.
People say, "Oh, the BBC, it's all eaten itself." The BBC are reporting about the BBC, but they do broadcast their defeats in a way that not just politically, but actually, it's willing to just say, we're not here to promote how brilliant we are all of the time. We can handheld high when it goes wrong.
Well, I believe in the new BBC building, there's another quote from George Orwell on the wall, and it says, "Freedom is the right to tell people what they don't want to hear."
By his statue on Broadcasting
Oh, you've
House.
seen it, yes.
I've heard some news journalists saying they're quite satisfied that when the politicians have to walk into the building for Laura Koonsberg on Sunday or whatever the show is, the politicians always have to walk past that slogan. So they had a nice little reminder that sometimes, hard truths are important, but there you are.
Interesting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your time, your memories of it, and indeed your service to the great ship of broadcasting.
Lucky.
Brilliant. Mary English joining us on the British Broadcasting Century.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Great to chat to Mary about her memories of days gone by at the Beeb. If you have worked in broadcasting, doesn't have to be BBC, and if you would like to reminisce with us, your recorded memories are most welcome. You can record and send to me a voice note, voice memo, paul@paulcarenza.com, or you can get in touch with me for a conversational chit-chat for the podcast. A last word then on simultaneous broadcasting. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, what do you think, based on this episode thus far? Did it do down local programming, or was it good to amplify the great and good from the capital and occasionally other stations too? In October 1923, a month into simultaneous broadcasting, Lord Gainford, the BBC chairman, keenly reassured shareholders that it is not our intention to dispense with the local station. We intend that local individuality shall be preserved, being of paramount importance. Undoubtedly, it grew the BBC from lots of local stations to something that, when it wanted, could send the finest musical artistes across every station, as well as, more regularly, news from London. But do you want news from London? Bear in mind at this point, there is little choice as to what to listen to. You can't channel hop quite as easily as we can nowadays. If you could only get your local BBC radio station or Radio 4, which would you choose? Maybe don't answer that, but it would be a shame to lose one in favour of the other. Wireless Weekly magazine, 5th September 1923. The news bulletins from 2LO are now being broadcast simultaneously from all the stations, and later musical transmissions will also take place. It may be possible to close down the provincial stations one evening a week in order that their listeners may hear London. It is rather difficult to say what dwellers in the provinces want. Some of them are not particularly keen on hearing London. Others could listen to 2LO every night. Who knows what the listeners want? Well, John Reith was said to give the listeners not what they wanted, but what they needed. What he thought they needed. And what he thought they needed was him reading the news, apparently. Either way, SB was here to stay, and it meant a few changes in how things were done. Director of Programmes Arthur Burrows wrote of this in his 1924 book, The Story of Broadcasting. The final details of the simultaneous programmes are decided upon at least 6 weeks in advance of performance. Station directors are at once informed of their nature in order that they may avoid introducing into their own programmes features of a similar character. Oh yeah, so SB meant a lot more planning to make sure that the programmes flowed best. Burroughs' deputy Cecil Lewis also wrote of simultaneous broadcasting. Now we're reading Cecil Lewis's Broadcasting from Within bit by bit on Patreon at the minute. Do join us for £5 a month if you would like to, and you can get the complete works. So to conclude this episode, an extended extract of Cecil Lewis's Broadcasting from Within with a beautifully poetic finish, I think, that shows you how simultaneous broadcasting links with something we'll cover soon on this podcast, the launch of the Radio Times. Lewis writes, "It will no doubt appear to you that there is nothing in common between these two, simultaneous broadcasting and the Radio Times. Unfortunately, there is too much. As you can imagine, programmes are worked out in detail some weeks ahead. The London station, owing to its increased facilities for artistes and special events, has usually something in every week's programme which will be of interest to the whole country. On the other hand, provincial stations too have their special nights, which it's worthwhile offering to other stations. In this way, a constant interchange, or general post, is always going on, guided in questions of policy by head office. It's a sort of glorified happy families, where everyone is asking everyone else what they have got or what they want. Have you Mr. Bones the butcher? No, but can you give me the Savoy Orpheans at 9:45? Thank you very much. Goodbye. For my past sins, I have become the referee in this game. When the family is not happy, something has to be done to make it so. A big chart hangs on the office wall which shows what everyone is supposed to be doing for 2 months ahead. As events are offered to stations, their acceptance or refusal of them is chalked up on the chart. Even when everything is well, it's a terrible tangle. The closest watch has to be kept on it all the time. What a mess we often get into. Letters in all directions. Glasgow takes Cardiff 9 to 9:30, Cardiff to London 7:30 to 9, London to all stations 10 to 11, and to Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Aberdeen from 7:30 onwards. Phone the news to Bournemouth, they can't take it on the simultaneous, and so on every day of the week. Anybody wanting a really maddening jigsaw to solve ought to come and try it. How does this, you'll be asking, affect the Radio Times? Well, we have to piece the jigsaw together a month in advance, see that it all dovetails into time quite accurately, and then set out all the programmes clearly and send them off to the printers. Between the time they've been sent off and the proofs are returned to us, someone comes along with a big special event, which must go in the programme, and the whole lot have to be recast, rearranged, retyped, and sent back again. They look so simple and straightforward when they appear in print, but oh, the tearing one's hair, the frantic telephone calls, the last-minute alterations that go on behind the scenes. The combination of SB and RT, both of which came into operation at about the same time, nearly drove us off our heads for the first few weeks. Even though the thing has now become an ordinary occurrence, which people are grumbling at as they do at everything they're used to, it never ceases to be a marvel to me how the great symphony concerts go along the roadsides, over the hills, through the towns, brushed by trees, soaked by rain, swayed by gales, all confined to a thin, innocent-looking piece of wire, and from these narrow limits are suddenly loosed out like a gushing fountain into the homes of millions of people over the length and breadth of the land. It seems more incredible than broadcasting itself almost. But the whole invention is the marvel of the age. The marvel of the age indeed. For the entire book, Broadcasting from Within by Cecil Lewis, read to you with explanatory interruptions. Do join us on Patreon, where we're doing it bit by bit. Bit by bit, moment by moment. We are getting there on the British Broadcasting Century. And next time, September 1923, some early moments of simultaneous broadcasting, that Rob Roy drama from Scotland, the first cat on radio, I'm not joking, and the build-up to the Radio Times. Plus, next episode, our guest is Gavin Sutherland. He has a record out of theme tunes called The Next Programme Follows Shortly. And it sounds a bit like this. By that now, The Next Programme Follows Shortly is the album. Gavin Sutherland joins us next time, and the next podcast follows shortly too. For this one, thank you to Mary English, this episode's guest, and thank you to books like Edward Pawley's BBC Engineering 1922 to 1972, Asa Briggs' The Birth of Broadcasting, and I lent on the memoirs of Peter Eckersley, Arthur Burrows, Cecil Lewis and John Reith this time too. These books and your support have fueled this episode of
The British Broadcasting Century. It's a solo-operated podcast presented and produced by Paul Carenza, original music by Will Farmer, and nothing to do with the BBC of the present day. Do support us on Patreon, and thanks if you do, and or support us by sharing this episode. You can rate or review it on Apple Podcasts and the like. You can join our thriving Facebook group, follow us on Blue Sky or X. You can come to Paul's live show, an evening of very old radio at Camden Fringe, West Berkshire Comedy Festival, the Isle of Wight, Ealing, Petersfield, and other places. paulcarenza.com/tour for details.
Be informed, educated, entertained and subscribed to join us next time as August becomes September 1923 on the British Broadcasting Century.